Hello and welcome to my review of the Primary Arms 4-14 by 44 millimeter first focal plane mil dot scope. This is one of their older scopes. I believe it was first introduced approximately 10 years ago. It is a rather simple scope, but it is also a very effective one. I'm going to start off here with just a few stats. The overall length is 13.5 inches. And the total weight is 23.9, so call it 24 ounces. And it has the 30 millimeter tube. And we will start at the rear with our fast focus eyepiece. This one has been well used and is still smooth and is still, got some decent tension on it, but it has loosened up over the years. We'll get this all the way out here to the end, right there. Bring it in about a half a turn or so, and we can see that we have maybe just a touch of play, but not much. So that's good. Oop, I need it about right there for me. So next we have our magnification ring. And with the 14 power sitting here at 12 o'clock, as we rotate the scope over, we see that the 4 power minimum is just past 6 o'clock on the bottom side. So we're looking at about maybe 200 degrees of rotation for the full throw. And one thing that this scope can use is a throw lever. It's not particularly tight, though it does have some pretty decent tension, but it's also pretty smooth. There's not a lot of grip in these individual grooves. And I've noticed that when my hands are wet, either sweaty or, in rain, that it's pretty easy to slip on those. Or if it's cold and you have gloves on, the same problem. So a throw lever would definitely be a benefit to this scope. Ahead of that, we have our elevation and windage turrets, which each have 6 mils of rotation per revolution and are set in 1/10 mil per click. On the opposite side, we have our side focus parallax adjustment, which goes down to a minimum of 10, and then obviously maxes out at infinity, or whatever, just past 1,000 yards at the top end. We'll take a closer look at all these controls here in a minute. Then on the front end, we just have some very simple branding, and then just our 4-14 by 44. On the bottom, we have our model number and our serial number, and of course made in China, which I know for some people is a bit of a deal breaker, but for the $199 that this thing routinely sells for, I think it's an extremely good value, which I may have given away the secret at the end of the video, but I do genuinely like this scope. And we will move on to looking at our turrets and parallax adjustment. We're going to take a quick look at this reticle in the Primary Arms 4-14. As we can see, it is the typical mil dot, where we have 4 dots going out on the 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock stadia that represent your windage and elevation holds. We're currently sitting at 14 power, and I'm going to dial it down to the minimum. Going through 10, 8, 6, and then 4 power. We can see that center mil dot gets pretty small, but we have our heavier individual stadia line coming in from the 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions that help draw the attention to the center. We'll go back up to 6, 8, 10, 12, and again at 14 power at the top. We can see that the lines and the dots stay nice and crystal clear all the way through the power range. There's not really much else to say about this. It's an effective range and windage system if you're familiar with it. Most people would be using the turrets to dial for distance and then using the individual mil dots to hold for your wind corrections. But the fineness of the center cross in the middle will allow you to get a very precise 0. And we will move on to looking at the turrets. Here we are looking at our elevation turret. I'm going to go ahead and dial it back down to 0. As you can hear, it has very audible clicks. This is a non-locking, non-zero stop turret. It does have the individual revolution counters so that you can keep track of where your 0 was once you have it set. You can mark that in your book or mark it right on your turrets or your rings somewhere so that you know where your 0 was if you need to return to it. Each rotation gives us 6 mils of adjustment with 1/10 mil increments per click. And for a scope that originally retailed for about $200, it has extremely nice tactile and audible clicks to these turrets. Probably one of the best in its price range. Unfortunately, it does not have a 0 stop or the return to 0, or locking turret, excuse me. It does have a return to 0. I think I said that wrong before. There is a small screw here on the elevation turret. So this uses a 3mm Allen key to loosen this screw, at which point it's actually a pretty decent sized screw. It's got fine threads on it and plenty of thread to engage with the tower. But then this turret, which is O-ring sealed, pops off, and you can simply return your turret to 0 after you've completed your zeroing process at the range. And the 0 actually lines up pretty close to perfect on the turret. Maybe just a slight discrepancy, but not enough to complain about for a scope that even now I think retails for about $250. I think you can find them on sale for about $199 a couple times throughout the year. This is obviously the non-illuminated version with just the mil dot, so it can be found for as little as like $150 on sale sometimes. But aside from that, it's just a simple but useful turret. Here we are looking at the windage turret, which is essentially the same as the elevation turret. It is not marked for left or right rotation, and it does still have the same 6 mils per rotation. But in this case, you'll have to be aware of which way you've been dialing. It does have the rev counter, so that you keep track of where you need to be. If you were the type of person who likes to dial for wind, you'll be able to return to 0 as long as you have marked or kept track of where your 0 is at on the rev counter. I'm going to be quiet here for just a second, let you listen to this turret. And like the elevation turret, there is very, very minor wiggle in that turret. You even have to try before it'll break over into the next one. There's just a very crisp nature to these turrets. Really probably some of the best turrets at this price range that you can buy. It's unfortunate they don't have a 0 stop or are non-locking, but you know, you get what you get. I personally use this scope on 22, so it's changing 0 all the time as ammo changes. And I find the ability to reset these turrets extremely convenient with just a 3mm Allen key. Alright, so we're going to take a quick look at our parallax adjustment, or side focus, whatever you prefer to call it. And we're going to go back down here to our minimum, which is at 10 yards, which is pretty close. We'll allow those people who are shooting at tiny little targets at close distances to be able to get their focus proper for those close ranges. And we see that the distance of the throw from 10 up to 100 is quite a bit of a dial. We're probably looking at about 250 to 260 degrees. And then from 100 to 1,000 is maybe 90 degrees, with just a small amount between, one stop at the top and the corresponding stop down there at the bottom. But most of your range of travel is going to be below 100 yards. And then when you get up here between 500 and 1,000, you're going to be doing a little bit of guesswork to try to dial that in if you're trying to get it very precise. Overall, I don't find it hard to use. It's a good size knob. It's smooth. There's no unevenness in the tension as you go around. The stop at the top and the bottom is positive. It doesn't have any real play in it. You're there and it stops. So it's a good dial. It works. It does what it's supposed to do. And I've never had any trouble with it. And I've used this thing quite a bit. And I enjoy using it. So I think from there, we're going to go outside and have a look through the scope. Okay, so we're going to do our eye chart now. And I have it set up at 15 yards. The scope will technically go down to 10 yards, but the mound in front of this building makes getting my tripod to be stable is basically impossible. So we're going to do 15 yards instead of 10. Needless to say that at 10 yards, you can see it even more clearly than you'll be able to see it here at 15. Right now we're at 4 power. We're going to go ahead and zoom up through our range. There's 8, 10, 12, and 14 power. And at 14 power, we can make out pretty much as much detail as we want to on those cards. We can read the words, we can make out the little holes punched in the center, and we can see the distinct difference between each of those colors on our color scale, as well as the finest line on our line chart. So what I will do is move us over a little bit to look at our playing card. My bottle of water. But even all the individual words and lines on that Christmas card, are easy to make out. If I pan us up, we have very nice color representation between the red, the blue, and the yellow, as well as the individual thin black lines that make up that bullseye. You can also see at the top of the chart, at the top of the target, the text written there. Read that if you want to. Brighten that up just a little bit because it is starting to get dimmer as we get into the afternoon here. I'll just give us a second here to look at these playing cards. We can make out the jokers and the fine detail on that spade, as well as all of the other playing cards. I have stepped us back to the 50-yard line, so we can take a look at this chart at this distance. Starting out at 4 power, we're going to go ahead and zoom it in. Going past 8 to 10 to 12, and then 14. And even as we're getting into the afternoon here, we can still make out quite a bit of detail on those individual cards. We can see the individual jokers. We can make out a lot of the details on our Christmas card, as well as our color scale. And as far as the mill dot is concerned,
even if you were shooting at, you know, half-inch targets, you'd be able to pinpoint those if you needed to use the mills for your windage calls
after dialing for elevation, which is really the ideal situation with this scope, since once you get below the horizontal stadia, you don't have any sort of obvious wind corrections. You'd be holding off in space.
So the idea for the scope is obviously to use the turrets to dial and then use the dots to hold for wind. But we can just not quite make out the number up there in the top right corner of our target above the bullseye. Just slightly out of focus, or not quite sharp enough to be able to read. But as far as like the details of this pole, it's nice and clean, edge to edge. We don't see any fall off except just very slightly at the very edge of our field of view. And the same is true in these individual bricks and in the missing paint there on the gray concrete of the building. And we can also make out quite a bit of detail in the concrete below the target, where we can see some of the grain and the rocks and stuff that make up that concrete. I will go ahead and move us back to the 100-yard line next. Okay, I have brought us out to the 100-yard line so we can see what that chart's going to look like at 100 yards. Would like to point out the details of that building, the steps and the door above it, and all of which is very nicely in picture and sharp. Start going up through our range here to 8, 10, 12, and 14. Move this down just a touch. There we can see quite a bit of detail in my soda bottle and in those bullseyes. We've lost some of the detail obviously in those playing cards, which the numbers are going to be pretty small at this distance. I had to pause us there for a second for a noisy plane rudely flying overhead. But even with the fine detail that we've lost, we can still make out quite a bit of the individual elements on that Christmas card, as well as that water bottle sitting next to it. And then there's just the details that we can make out in that power pole that is still nice and sharp all the way at the right edge of the image, as well as the missing paint and gray exposed concrete there at the left edge, and in the grass and concrete down there below the targets. We can make out a fair amount of detail in that concrete as well. And if I pan us up just a bit, we can make out all the details on that sign, the number 5, the different bits of rust and corrosion, as well as the grout lines between those individual masonry blocks on the building itself. Then up here, just to get an idea of what our chromatic aberration is going to look like against the sky with that antenna, we see that it is, there's some there, but it's not bad, including along the top edge of that building where it meets the skyline. We only just have the slightest presence of the purple fringing. And I think that's about all we need to see here at 100 yards. Okay, here we are at our 300-yard line with our area regulations, and we are starting at 4 power. I'm going to go ahead and zoom us in a little bit to about 10. That way we can start to see those details on those signs starts to clear up. You can see the
berm in the background is also nicely in focus, as is the field of cut corn stalks there in the foreground. That's at probably 150 yards, about halfway to the signs. And then as we get up here to our maximum 14 power, the signs become much more legible. Even the one on the brown backer, we can see those individual sheets of paper. Obviously they're not legible, but we can tell that there are some details on there and where each individual sheet is. We've lost a little bit of our brightness, but our overall sharpness has remained the same. And we get a nice clean image. The mill dots on the reticle don't take up too much space on those individual signs. And if you were going to dial for distance, those individual mill marks would be very easy to make your windage adjustments. Go ahead and back this out once real quick, and then I will move us over to our 550 yard building. Moving a little bit quickly today because we're running out of sunlight. But even in this dim light, we can see quite a bit of detail. Let me move over here to these vehicles. It's a little bit more of a real world application. We can see the details in those wheels and in the grill of that truck. There's a little bit of aberration, a little purple fringing where the black and the white on that grill touch, but overall a nice image, not a lot of chromatic aberration messing up the image. And you can see the details in the trees right behind the black SUV. Those are going to be right at that same 300 yard line. So overall, a very pleasant image. Let's go ahead and move out to our 350 yard building. I know I said the 500, but we're actually going to do 350 first, because we would have to pan past it anyway. Here we are. Given the fact that we have fairly neutral lighting with these clouds, we don't have to worry about a bunch of glare coming off of that building from the direct sunlight that we have seen in the past. Just adjust that focus slightly. All right, so 4 power. We will start going up. Till we get to about 10. And as we've seen on other scopes, this one is doing just as nicely. You can see all those individual bricks, the elements on those transformers, and the wires coming from the building to the power pole are easy to discern. We also have some nice detail in those branches on that tree in the right side of the image, and on the silver piping coming out of the back of the building. We can see some of that hail damage. I'll go ahead and take us all the way up to 14. And now you can really see that hail damage on that stainless steel pipe. And we can make out the number 75 up there on our center transformer, as well as pretty much as much detail as you would want to on those bricks. Gone ahead and adjusted that brightness just a touch, help us make out those bricks a little bit better. That more accurately represents what you see with the naked eye through the scope. And overall, we have just a very nice image, which, not surprising, we're only gone out another 50 yards from where we were at the area rules and regulation signs. Before I move on to the 500 yard building, I do want to call out those little individual bolt heads that you can see on the metal framework down below the bricks. It's a nice little bit of detail that you can make out with this scope. And we're going to take a quick look at our transformers. I've lined this up so that you can see an idea of how those mill dots line up with those smaller transform elements. Those are about the size of a beer can or a soda can. So that just gives you an idea of how much
of the image the individual dots and lines take up. If you were trying to, shoot precisely at that distance, it would cover up a little bit, but not to a degree where it would be hampering your ability to be precise. I also like how we can see those wires going from the power pole in the center to the one just at the left edge. That one at the left edge is approximately 60 yards closer. So it's right about 290 yards between the difference in distance between those two power poles. Those two. But both of them are, shown plenty of detail, even though our parallax is set for the 350 yards of the building. It's a pretty nice image. And just for comparison, the trees in the background behind the power pole are at about 500 yards, maybe about 450. So if I dial this up just a little bit, we'll see those clean up a little bit, but we don't lose a whole bunch of detail on our transformer, even when I adjust the parallax for the tree line behind it. So really the depth of field is pretty versatile on this particular scope. And now I'm going to move us and look at the 550 yard building out there to the left. But I have to pause this for a second and move the tripod. All right, I've gone ahead and moved the tripod and returned us back to 4 power. And again, we see just how well the depth of field is resolved here at 4 power, where we can see everything from these dead sunflowers here in the foreground all the way out to that building at 550 yards. And there's no real change in focus for any of it. So let's start going up in our magnification. We'll get to 10 power. We're starting to see a fair amount of the detail on that building, and even on the lines going from the building to the power pole. And now we're at 14 power, and we can see those lines of those bricks and the details in our handrails on the steps there on the right side, as well as a nice amount of detail in the framework underneath the building. And if you look down there just at the bottom, just left of the vertical stadia, you can see that yellow cable protector that goes up as a support wire for our power pole. And on the transformer there on the right side, we can see our black number 75. It's not a super clear 75, but we know from previous experience that that is the number 75 on there. And then the last kind of detail on the building that I'd like to point out is our radio antenna up there on the top of the building, just to the right of our red heat vent. And we have, quite a bit of detail in the tree line behind it. If you look at the trees underneath the steps, let me just adjust this a little bit. Right in that area, we have quite a bit of detail between the grass underneath the stairs and the tree line behind them. And the tree line is just over 600 yards away, so it's maybe about 50 to 75 yards beyond the actual building and those stairs themselves. But in these lighting conditions, our chromatic aberration is, really very minimal. I think the only place you see much is going to be over here, where you get some sun, some residual sunlight kind of bouncing off of that steel pipe. But even on that, it's just on the very edge. I think these lighting conditions are my favorite for shooting, just because they are the least challenging to get a good image. Alright, so this pump house is set almost exactly 1,000 yards from where we are currently. And as we look at 4 power, we actually have a pretty decent image. We have a nice depth of field. We can see quite a bit of detail in the grass headed out there across the field. Let me get us zoomed in we can get a better look. Adjust this parallax because we are definitely not set properly for 1,000 yards. There we are. And at this distance, we're currently at 10 power. The individual brickwork is basically washed out because of the brightness of the sun. I've adjusted that exposure a little bit just to give us a better contrast on that building. And like I said before, now we're definitely able to make out that heat mirage as it's crawling across our field and causing some wavering in those handrails, which have become a little more difficult to make out. They sort of blur together with that mirage. But we still see the same evidence of chromatic aberration. I'm going to take us up to 14 power. And it just wants to make out those bricks, but I think given the conditions today with the mirage and with the extra sunlight, that is just not in the cards. What is interesting is if you look down here at the bottom of the scope at those dead sunflowers, those are, let me get a range on them. Those are at approximately 300 yards. So I think that's rather interesting that we have as much detail in those as we do when we're set our parallax to just at 1,000, looking at our building out there at the distance. We do, if you look very closely, you can see the vertical pole of the antenna sticking off of the right side of the building. But we're definitely starting to lose the finer detail just as a consequence of our distance. The same is true in our transformer. At this point, you know, your individual mil dots would completely obscure some of those smaller elements, but the transformer itself is still easy to pick out, as are the cross poles above them. But we've pretty much lost all of the individual wires at this distance. And now I will move us out to the 1,275 yard building, and that will be the last one for the day. All right, so we see our last building for the day at 1,275 yards. The tree line behind it is at about 1,325 yards. And we are currently sitting at 4 power. I like to take notice of the individual power poles set throughout the field of view there. Those go anywhere from approximately 400 yards, 450 yards, all the way at the left, and they end up way back there in the distance, probably around 1,100 to 1,300 yards, just depending on which one you're talking about. But it is interesting that even at those different distances, we can still make out a fair amount of detail on each individual pole at our 4 power. I'll go ahead and zoom us up. Pause here for a minute at 10x and readjust our view. There we go. And at this distance, the mirage we're seeing across the field is definitely causing some movement in the image. Well, that is to be expected. For a scope of this quality, to get even that good of an image at that distance under today's conditions is more than you could really hope for a retail scope that retails around $250. And we can see that we can make out the handrails to a degree. They're starting to blur together, especially given the mirage. We still have our chromatic aberration, but the individual details of the framework holding up the building and the elements of our power poles are still giving us a fair amount of detail. Obviously, with only 14 power, anything less than maybe a 10-inch target, or really even a 12-inch target, I mean, would be a difficult target to hit, partially just because you're looking at one MOA would be approximately a 12.5 or 13-inch target at this distance. So anything smaller than that is going to be not only hard to see, but definitely hard to use as a target. But things like a full-size IPSC target, or your 18 to 24-inch plates, you have enough glass clarity here that you would be able to take those shots, as long as you do your part with the wind and the elevation calls. But overall, I'm very pleased with this image that we're getting here. I like the color representation. The field of view is acceptable, and the overall size of the image, though on the small size, has enough detail to allow you to use the scope without much problem. And I think that I will call it that for the day at this distance.
So here we are at the end of the video, and it's time for me to give you my final opinions of this scope, which I may have already stated at the beginning of the video that I truly enjoy this scope. Of all of the non-red dot, non-LPVO scopes that I own, this one has seen the most range time by far. I've had it on ARs, 308 rifles, 6.5, 5.56 bolt guns, and it currently resides on my favorite 22, and it's been in every kind of weather you can imagine, from 100 degrees to 25 degrees, rain and snow, and it has not one time given me any issues. Maybe it's the simplicity of it that makes it so durable, but I could easily recommend this scope to anyone and feel like they were going to get a good, solid piece of glass that would serve them for a wide variety of applications. The 4 to 14 magnification range is very versatile. You've seen in the video that the quality of the image that you see even out to 500 yards is more than adequate for precision shooting. And in most people's situations, 500 yards is going to be something that they will rarely get an opportunity to shoot at. So they would have more scope than they're ever going to need in that situation, where the average shooter is going to be at 100 yards at their local range, maybe 200 yards, where this is not going to struggle in any way. So there's not a whole lot else to say about it, other than I think it's something that people look at as sort of an old school, outdated scope, but it isn't. I mean, it has been around for a long time. It's been around 10 years or more, and it copies, even older designs with the basic mil-dot reticle, but that's because it works. And if you don't have a tremendous budget and you can find the $200 to get yourself a better piece of glass than the typical $100 to $150 3x9s and 4 to 16 second focal planes that are out there, this is something you should consider. If you're not hard set on illumination or locking turrets, then this is going to work. And I don't know that I have much more to say than that. I appreciate everyone that stuck around this long to listen to my rambling, and I would appreciate it if you'd give me a like and possibly a comment if you have something to add to the discussion, or if you don't, if you just want to throw something down there to fuel the algorithm, I would appreciate it. And I hope to have you back for the next one. Thank you.